But today specifically, I'm going to root us in chapter 6, starting in verse 11, and we read the following. Our great desire is that you will keep on loving others as long as life lasts, in order to make certain that what you hope for will come true. Then you will not become spiritually dull or indifferent. Instead, you will follow the example of those who are going to inherit God's promises because of their faith and endurance. So we continue to read, and he says, for example, there was God's promise to Abraham. Since there was no one greater to swear by, God took an oath in his own name, saying, I will certainly bless you, and I will multiply your descendants beyond number. And then Abraham waited patiently, and he received what God had promised. And so this guy, Abraham, is going to be blessed if he trusts God. And the world, if he trusts God, the world can then receive grace. Are you listening? We get a glimpse of God's desire to be in relationship with us. So he again chooses people, just as he did in the intended order. He again chooses people as part of his larger vision so that through this people, through this family of Abraham, God's going to bring a blessing to all nations. And so we'll come back to the verse we started with. For example, there was God's promise to Abraham. Since there was no greater to swear by, God took an oath in his own name, saying, I will certainly bless you, and I will multiply your descendants beyond number. Then Abraham waited patiently, and he received from God what was promised. Now, when people take an oath, the pastor of Hebrews writes, they call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. And without any question, that oath is binding. God also bound himself with an oath, so that those who received the promise could be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. So God has given both his promise and his oath. These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence. We can trust as we hold to the hope that lies before us. So we see this guy's making a plea, and he says, and it seems to say, I want to suggest, that in this plea of trusting God, that even though, because he knows the original church, even though things are not going well for you, even though things are spiraling out of control, just trust God's promise. And this is where he connects it all for us. He reminds us that Abraham was, yes, led into a new land. And yes, he was promised to be a father. How else are you going to be a father of all these, of the nation and be blessed and all that kind of stuff? And yet he and his wife Sarah had no children. Like for a long time. Like they're like in their 70s and there's still nothing happening. They're in their 90s and nothing's happening. Like they're super old. When will actually God come through? Can he? And then although Hebrews shows Abraham is very patient, he actually isn't. Abraham becomes impatient and Sarah becomes impatient. And they're like, we have no children. We can't understand, how will God provide? How will we be this great nation if we don't have kids? And so they actually lose trust. So much so that Sarah says, hey, we have a servant girl, Hagar. Abraham, go sleep with her. We'll orchestrate, we'll perform. We will bring God's promise to completion. We will achieve what we know is from God. We're trusting, we're waiting, but it's taking too long. We will do this. We will do this. And of course, their actions creates more pain, more hurt. But chapter 22 is an incredibly difficult chapter. What we find in this chapter is that God has now blessed Abraham and Sarah. They finally have a child, Isaac. And it happens literally in the chapter before 22. It's literally one chapter before, chapter 21, my math is accurate here. One chapter, 21, they have a child. Chapter 22, God tests Abraham and asks him to sacrifice his son. What? Wait a minute. Why would God do this? They've waited. Yes, they messed up, they did their things on their own, but now God has finally blessed them. God is true to his promises. God, they don't come through, but God comes through. They have a child, sacrifice him. Is God that vindictive? Is God vindictive? Now, if you're feeling uncomfortable, good, you should be. This is awful. But it's an important thing for us to look at anthropologically into that time and era to understand that this is actually something that's happening. Secondly, the confusing part of this request is in fact that throughout the entire scriptures, God keeps saying he detests this kind of practice, that he's against child sacrifice, that he's opposed to this ritual. We see it over and over and over that God says, I'm against it. I despise it. I hate it. So why is he asking it? And thirdly, how will God's promise come to fruition if Abraham and Sarah finally have a child and now he's being sacrificed? We read again. So God has given both his promise and his oath. These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence. We can trust as we hold to the hope that lies before us. The author of Hebrews, the pastor, is pulling us into these confusing threads to say, do you trust? Do you trust that God will come through, not in the way the world around you promises, where you achieve something, where you perform, where you do a great task, or rather, do you trust that God will bless, that God will do what he says he will do, even when all the good is spiraling out of control? Do you believe that in the midst of disaster, in the midst of pain, in the midst of sickness, in the midst of death, in the midst of life's storms, that God actually still wants to bless you and keep his promises? And then he says, this hope, this trust, this hope in God is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Authors playing out all these things back to Abraham and all this test and trust. Do you trust that God will actually come through? Do you trust that he will bless you? Do you trust that he will not act like the world? And the pastor tells us that in the midst of all uncertainty, in the midst of all the things like, where are you, God? Can I trust you? I'm impatient. What do I do? He tells us that God is an anchor. Now, what is an anchor? What does the anchor do? Now, we know it's anchor in Greek, but what does it do? Does it prevent storms? Does it guarantee smooth rides? Does it keep us from horrible situations and moments in life that are so hard and difficult? Does it prevent best laid plans from spiraling out of control? No, the anchor doesn't do that. But what the anchor does is it literally keeps us steady. It secures us in the midst of a storm. It provides us safety and hope that we won't go adrift. It keeps us anchored in the turbulent and stormy seasons of life. Are you listening? Dr. James Finley said it this way: if we are absolutely grounded, and I'm forcing the word anchored, if we are absolutely anchored in the absolute love of God that protects us from nothing. Let me read that again. If we are absolutely anchored in the absolute love of God that protects us from nothing, even as it sustains us in all things, then we can face all things with the courage and tenderness and touch the hurting places in others and in ourselves with love.